I'd like to introduce you to a legend in Irish aviation, Pearce Cahill. We're here at his home in Skerries with so much memorabilia from the flying days and his very, very interesting life. Hello, Pearce. Thank you for having us here.
Thank you.
When did your interest in flying start?
I took an interest in flying the day my father purchased 3 aircraft, and that would be the 6th of September 1930, and they were delivered into Baldonnel. Only 2 of the aircraft arrived, and the aircraft my father was in ran into trouble and had to make a forced landing at a place called Bootle outside of Liverpool. So when I arrived at Baldonnel as a young lad, 2 aircraft arrived, one a Gypsy Moth and the other a De-Suiter. And I had to act for my father, who wasn't there, to bringing them into the country.
And were these commercial aircraft?
Well, they were used commercially for training and for air taxi work. That's Oliver Armstrong, chief pilot of Iona, handing over the mail to the post office official that he'd picked up at Galway from a German liner, and it was flew to Dublin, and it was handed over to the post office, and they put it on the KLM machine that's in the background, and it flew on to Berlin, and it brought the American mail from New York to Berlin 2 days earlier. Well, that's my father in the light coat congratulating the 2 passengers who were going on their honeymoon to Paris in the year of 1930. My interest, of course, in flying was brought about by my father's interest in flying. And my first flight was in late September out of a field here at Skerries at the back of the house where I'm living at the moment. And the pilot was a man called Tyndall. And I heard afterwards that my father gave instructions to the pilot to put this fellow off flying for good. So I had the best aerobatics I've ever had in my life, and I enjoyed it. Around 1928, when the Irish Aero Club was established at Baldonnel, Malone got my father interested at that time. But my father never had direct dealings, or was never a member of the Irish Aero Club, although he had an interest in flying. His interest was that Malone encouraged him to start a commercial operation. During the Congress, the Eucharistic Congress, we flew the Lord Mayor of New York from Dublin to Portsmouth to catch a boat back to New York after the Congress here. This is a photograph taken after Emily Earhart came to Dublin after her flight from America, and she was on a visit to Kildonal, and she's accompanied by Amy Johnson and Jim Mollison, who were famous flyers at that time.
Now here I have your pilot's logbook. Amazing. And your first solo flight is listed in here for 1933.
That is correct. I went solo in 1933. I think it was in March, right? April 1933. From Kildonal Aerodrome, an aerodrome that my father started just outside of Finglas, and it was operating up to the start of the last war, and then it was closed up then.
And during the last war, you were in the army, I believe.
I joined the emergency. I was in the transport, and I was stationed in different places, west of Ireland, south of Ireland, Cork, Limerick, and I was in Dublin, and I even ran a turf convoy from Longford to Dublin for a while as well.
A turf convoy?
Yeah, carrying turf from the bog.
All right. And you were in the army when the bombs went off on the Strand.
I was in Athlone the night North Strand was bombed. Actually, I was the orderly officer that night, and I was the first to get the information from the duty officer in Dublin, and I was amazed because there was an awful lot of activity going on in the country at the time, and there was a bit of a stand too after the bombing. McSweeney, I think it was OC of Western Command at the time, and he retired shortly after that. The information I got was that the North Strand there was a bomb in it, and there was a bomb dropped in the Phoenix Park. And at the same time, there was troop movements in the north of Ireland. A number of the battalions in Athlone and in the northern territory of the country were put on a stand too, not knowing what was happening. And it took a day or so to find out that it was only a big exercise they were carrying out in the north. It wasn't a raid into the 26 counties.
It's a great honour and pleasure for me to welcome you here this evening to this special Iona night. It's great to see that the name Iona can still draw such a huge crowd. It's much greater than we had hoped for, so it's terrific. And I think the size of the crowd reflects the legacy of Iona in all its aspects, but in particular it reflects the interest in the character of the man who was there on the first day in 1930 and on the last day in 1994. And tonight we honour him.
De-Suiter aircraft that my father bought, that's EIAAD, it happened to be the 4th aeroplane ever registered here, and it would be the first commercial aircraft ever put on the Irish register. He purchased the aeroplane in 1930, and in the middle of 1931 he decided that the aeroplane wasn't suitable for the type of work that he wanted to do with the aircraft. It took a longer run to get off the ground than some of the gypsy-engined aircraft did. So he sold it, and it went to England, and then it went from there to Australia, and it ended up in Tasmania. And it became the first aeroplane of a number of big airlines that have started out there. In fact, I think one of them was Ansett, and that aeroplane started a service from Tasmania to an island off Tasmania called Flinders, and the aeroplane was called Miss Flinders, and it was in operation there and in a lot of other duties, and it was flying in Australia until 1962, and then it was put in store. And then it was brought back to Tasmania and put literally into a glass case in the airdrome at Launceston. And I'm in the process now of trying to get the aeroplane back to Ireland and present it to the new museum in Collins Barracks, where they have an aeronautical set up there. And it'll be the oldest aeroplane of the Irish register.
Excellent. And what are the chances, you think, of getting it back?
In fact, a letter or an email I received today from the curator of the museum in Tasmania is very encouraging. Like he says, the aeroplane is an antique as far as they're concerned, and it represents a lot of things, but he says he thinks it's more beneficial to Ireland than it is to them. So I'm working on that.
Well, that would be a marvellous addition to the museum.
And in fact, to have it all worked out how I'll dismantle it and get it back, that's no problem. It's to get my hands on it is the main thing.
Well, that was the question I was going to ask you. What way would you transport it? But you obviously have...
Oh, yeah. I'll put it in a box and bring it back.
And then put it back together again.
Yeah.
I would have to say straight away that I've been at many a book launch in my time, not necessarily launching books, but at book launches. And this is the biggest crowd I have ever experienced for any book launch anywhere at any time. It's quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. And that means it's nothing more and nothing less than a huge tribute to Pearce and the family and the airline and indeed the history of aviation in Ireland, because I know that the vast majority of people here gathered are connected in some way with aviation in Ireland, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Even the department are here, because and I managed to deal with them too, but the effort into this book doesn't pay half the compliment it should to the work my father put into this. My father was a person that lived when the motor industry was just in its infancy, aeroplanes was in their infancy, the rocket and things like that weren't even thought of. And he was a man that had great foresight. He travelled the world. There's a lot of stories that could be told about him that are not in this book. He brought the first taximeters into Dublin around about, I think, 22 or 23. And when the first taxi was put on the road, the Jarvies grabbed it and turned it upside down and objected to the taxis. He went into an awful lot of businesses. He formed a company called Multi Products. He formed Iona Engineering Works, and the engineering works proved during the war to be a great asset to this country in that they had equipment and they were able to carry out work that would normally have been done in some continental countries, such as when Irish shipping started operating. We had a mobile electric welding plant, and it spent nearly the whole war years sticking the Irish ships together when they come in, just glue them back together again. Another job which we got very little credit for was that the telegraph station in Valencia had an old stationary engine, a 4-cylinder stationary engine, and it just rusted apart. And I remember the company taking on the job of making a new cylinder block, and they got castings done by Tunge and Taggart's, I think it was, and it was a pains and trying effort in that you do a tremendous amount of machining and then suddenly a big hole appears in the casting. There wasn't enough metal, and on the 4th attempt they succeeded in making a cylinder block and getting the cable station working again. That was the type of work that my father encouraged. But times changed in the motor business, in the engineering business. A lot of the old firms that were in the engineering business, the type of work they were doing, there's no need for it anymore, and the type of work changed.
Feel safe, feel secure. ATA Security.
My father was fairly far-seeing. Actually, I would say he saved my life to a certain extent. He bought me a ticket, and he decided in 1939 that we'd go to New York for the World Fair was on there. And I think around about May or June, he says, "I don't like the look of things." And I said, "What do you mean?" Well, he says, "If we go out there, you may bring your toolbox, which I don't think we'll get back." So actually, I was delighted, because at that time I was doing a bit of car racing, and I entered for the Phoenix Park 1939 car race, which I was delighted not to go. But in any case, we were booked on a boat called the Athenia, and it was the first one to be sunk during the war. So I'd say that's where my life was saved. I had a great interest in car racing, and I drove numerous saloons and things like that in reliability trials, and I thought I'd try and get something that I could race. And a friend of mine, MacArthur, had an MG which he traded in to Tracy's in Stephen's Green, and it was up for sale for £200. And I twisted my father's arm and got him to buy it for me. Got the car, and I entered it, I think, in 1937 for the Phoenix Park car race, which I finished reasonably well up. In 1938 and 1939, I drove the car in Tala. In the Phoenix Park in 1939, I finished second. And from there on then, the war put a stop to things until after the war. car racing started in the middle 40s after the war. I drove in Dundrod, north of Ireland, in Cork, and different hill climbs around the country, and won nearly every one of them. And from there on, the car became known as the Iona Special then, because we had altered it so much from the I actually was second in the tourist trophy race in the north, and I met the Lord Craigavon come out to introduce himself to me, and the first thing he asked me what I was doing up in the Black North, and I had a look at him. I told him the place couldn't be any blacker, but that was some of my experiences. And then in the 50s, I sold the car and I went through numerous hands, and it ended up in America with a man called David Raymond, who was an MG expert in the States and ran a number of MG cars. And he actually came to Ireland and paid me a visit to get the whole history of the car. And about a year or two, it would be 2 years ago, I think, he brought the car over to Ireland, brought it down to me here in Skerries, and asked me would I drive it in the commemoration of the Newtonards circuit, where they had a special commemoration of 75 years of driving there. And I was delighted to get back into the car. But when I got back into it after driving the modern cars, I thought it was a terrible banger, but there you are. I had another experience in the motor racing, and I was the last one to drive up the hill of Kiltiernan. I upended the car and got my fingers caught between the steering wheel and the ground, and I was put into an ambulance, and the ambulance disappeared off into the mountains and got lost. And I had to sit up on the back and tell them where to go. Yeah. My experience in flying, I've flown all over Europe. I flew to I used to fly regularly to Rotterdam to an aircraft rally there, and the Aero Club in Rotterdam would reciprocate by flying over to Dublin. And we used to go to the Cognac rally, and it's one of these rallies that you have to be in your health, because it was the first time there was ever 8 glasses in front of me on the table, and I had to try them all. And before that, earlier on, you had been attending a tasting competition of different brandies and things like that, and I never saw so much drink in all my life carried out. In fact, I remember 2 blokes from, I think, Poland, who were at the rally. They won the rally, and the prize was their own weight in brandy. So they were put on the scales, and they put on the other side the equal weight of brandy, and they had to tell the 2 wives to go home by airline so that they have room to bring all the brandy back. They had no room for them in the aeroplane. So that was my experience there. But as far as accidents go, I had one serious accident in a 182 which wrote the aeroplane completely off. I was attending it was the end of a famous conference of pilots and whatnot in this country from all over the world, visited here, and there was a final due in Cork, and weather and whatnot was against us going down there, but we went down and landed in a very short strip, and when I come in to land and touch down, I saw there wasn't a hope of stopping, so I attempted to overshoot. I got the aeroplane off the ground, but hit the top of a fire engine, and we set all the fire extinguishers off. And I ended up in a whole heap of trees with my friend Tom Farrington and Catherine Green. Lucky enough, we got out without any scrapes. Another incident I had was flying in Ulster, where it was a holiday weekend. I forget now that it was during the summer, and I paid a visit to the Parachute Club. And then I went from there, I went to Burr and paid them a visit because I had an aeroplane there flying with the club as well. And when I took off from Burr, I was heading for Kerry, and on the way, the engine just suddenly stopped near Nina, and I had a look down, and my instructor always said, there's only one field that you're able to land in, and that's rightly below you. So I went in, I made a perfect landing into this strip. I slapped myself on the back without a scratch. And I had no way of communication except by radio, so I managed to contact the machine at Birr in the air flying, and I contacted my radio and told him I'd forced landed, and he thought I was literally codding him, and he told me to F off. He says, don't be codding me. So I had an awful job trying to convince him that I had, but then when I saw the plane in the distance, I told him I could see him and pointed at him. So he flew down, saw me on the ground, went back to Birr, and down came a rescue crowd, and they brought me back to Birr to Dooley's Hotel, whom I knew the staff there very well. And when they heard what happened, they just put points on the bar from one end to the other and said, you start here and you can go when you finish down there. And the funny thing about it was, you could get the exact date because there was a telephone strike and I wasn't able to use the telephone to tell anybody what happened to me. And when I decided then that if I sent a message by the air, everybody would know that I had a forced landing, so I didn't want to do that. So a bit of jiggling and poking around by saying that I was stuck at Birr and I wanted a special spanner brought down from Dublin. I sent a message that way and they flew down from Dublin and picked me up. I had to send a truck to collect the aeroplane.
And when did you leave the army, Pearce?
I left the army and went on to reserve in 1943. And the reason for that was I decided I'd get married. Right. And I had to apply to the army for permission to be allowed to get married. And the funny thing about it was, the day before I got married, I got a whiz-banger to report back for duty immediately. Well, that didn't happen. I went back the next day.
And you had to go back the next day after the wedding?
Yeah, I spent my honeymoon in Limerick, where I was stationed.
Oh, right. And when did you resume the flying again?
It's a long story about how I managed to start flying. I was very interested in motor car events like reliability trials and a lot of car racing. And there was a friend of mine, Kevin Murray, in Sligo, and he happened to buy an aeroplane and found out that I knew how to fly, and he got in touch with me, and I went down to Sligo to his place and had a few flights, and that got me interested again. And from there on, I took an interest and went out to Derby Kennedy then to get my licence properly stamped so that I could properly fly under the new regulations. The regulations had changed an awful lot from the time I went solo. In fact, the requirement to have a licence when I went solo in 1933 was only 8 hours of flying and pass a test. And then it had been changed to 40 hours of flying and a whole book of regulations, and it was like the Road Traffic Act. You had to learn when to turn right and when to turn left and when to look behind you.
It was probably to do with the different models of aircraft that had come online as well.
Well, aircraft, of course, became a lot more sophisticated with all the modern equipment and radio and whatnot. There was, in my days, when I learned to fly, there was no radio in use at that time on aircraft.
So you were on your own?
On your own, exactly, yeah.
I'm Louisa, Pearce's granddaughter, 4th generation pilot. I'm in Aer Lingus, and we're here to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the arrival of the first commercial aircraft in Ireland.
Welcome all here today on this very historic occasion, the 75th anniversary of Ireland's first commercial airline. We're here to commemorate the arrival at Baldonnel on the 5th of September 1930 of Ireland's first commercial airline, the De Suter EIAAD, purchased by Hugh Cahill. On that day, 2 aircraft were ferried to Baldonnel. There was the De Suter by a man called Mr. L.S. Tyndall, and there was a Gypsy Moth by Jim Malone. Hugh's ambition to foster commercial aviation in the new Free State was born that day. It was 6 years later that the state itself opened its own airline, Aer Lingus.
Feel safe, feel secure. ATA Secured.
Baldonnel has always had a part to play in aviation history in Ireland, and for many it is the home of aviation in Ireland. We are very proud of those links, and we do try and remember them and maintain them and try and keep them going.
Well, when I try to remember back, well, damn it all, 75 years takes a bit of memory. And today I'm trying to figure out how I got here. I don't know how I got out. I know I was here. But I'll tell you a story that at that particular time, my father ran a garage, and he had a contract with the Customs and Excise for driving a customs officer from the point at the North Wall to Baldonnel to clear aircraft that came in. And this was always done after the airplane landed. Like, the airplane landed, then they rang up for the customs, and then they had to ring us up for a taxi. And I used to jump into the taxi and come out. In those days, funny thing about customs, you could smuggle anything you wanted into the country in those days. That was great, because my old man ordered me a fur coat for flying, and a fellow named Geoffrey de Havilland, I think it was, flew a gypsy moth over, and he was waving at me in a big parcel like that, brown paper box, and he says, "Here, take this before the customs officer comes." And it was a nice fur coat for flying in. But when I got into an aeroplane, I discovered it wasn't worth a damn, because the wind went in one side and just come out the other. You'd want leather equipment. But there's some of the things I remember from those times. Incidentally, you notice that it was Iona National Air Taxis and Flying School. And I think a year afterwards, then the father formed a company and he called it Iona National Airways. But that is a replica of the aeroplane as it is, or as it was.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And in 1956, almost a half a century ago, the Iona aviation was revitalised. Pearce set up his operations at Dublin Airport, where it expanded, reaching a peak in the early 1990s, when it was the second largest airline in Ireland, second only to our national carrier, Aer Lingus.
Iona, when I got it going in 55, my family became interested. In fact, we trained a tremendous number of pilots. Son-in-law was flying with all these old big propellered four-engine airplanes, and then my granddaughter became a pilot in Aer Lingus, and she's living now out in Dubai, and her husband is a pilot with one of the Dubai Airways companies. He was trained by us in Cork, and another granddaughter of mine is working for Eurocontrol in Belgium and Brussels. And so we're in aeroplanes from all angles.
You were saying that one of your aircraft was in a movie.
Oh, a number of them. Actually, a number of them were in movies. One of the 172s was used as an air-to-air camera carrier for taking photographs of them flying during the manoeuvres that they carried out for the film in the Blue Max. And an old Ulster aircraft we have was used when it was kidnapping, I think, a German general or something like that. And it did a takeoff from Ballyfree airfield, where they had tufts of hay lighting to light the runway while it was getting off the ground. And with the aircraft were used in a new, the one that I actually did some flying in I was the person that took off in an airplane after the great train robbery with the bullion all on the back. And I always remember there was a famous actor with me. He was the main person. And I remember the first time we carried out this action, carrying the box across, I was told to stop, make the blooming so-and-so box look heavy. I had to go back and repeat all we were doing, and got into the airplane then and took off, and they managed to show the shot, although it was done in daylight, that it looked like as if it was done at night. They had some sort of film or filters on the camera lens, so that when you seen it on the film, you thought it was a takeoff at night. It was very interesting. And they were the most interesting ones I was involved in. There was a company started up here, and they had the Piper Agency. I think it was Flightline, I think they called themselves. And they brought they approached me to know would I assemble Pipers for them. So I said yes, I would. So they brought in, I think it was 12 Piper Cubs fitted with special spray gear for locust control and things like that, and I think they had sold them to Egypt or somebody like that, and I assembled them and did the final assembly then in the hangars at Dublin Airport, and we test flew them, and they were all on the British register, and they went out to Egypt. And then after that I decided then that I'd try and build a hangar at Dublin Airport. I got permission to operate from there, and we rented some land and built a hangar there, and then the Piper agents moved into the hangar with me, and I had a store there, and I think they were with me for about 2 or 3 years, and from there then they decided that their big business was in England, and they moved to Oxford, and they took over Oxford and formed a company called CSE, and they became the biggest air operator of light aircraft in England, and they had an agency for the Piper aircraft for Ireland, England, and I think part of Europe as well, and they did a big business then over there. But even then we were storing aircraft in Dublin for them, twin engines aircraft mostly, and we used to take out the tanks and put in the seats and everything like that to the twin engine aircraft that had flown the Atlantic, so that they'd be ready for sale for them. And that went on for 3-4 years. And then from there on I purchased some second-hand aircraft and started the Irish Aero Club going at Dublin Airport, and that from there on I built on that.
The Aero Club?
Yeah.
And is that where you would train people to fly?
That's where we trained people to fly. And then in 1936 I took on the Cessna agency, and from 1936 until I think about 96 or sometime around then, I managed to sell over 100 aircraft in Ireland. And we had a fairly big business going there, but overheads and restrictions actually put us out of business in the middle 90s. We couldn't keep up with the restrictions from all angles. We were stopped flying at Dublin Airport because they were too busy for training, and as well as that, I think Airline wanted to get us out of there because I had land beside Dublin Airport where I wanted to build some extra buildings on, and I wouldn't be given planning permission. Actually, it just goes to show you that Airline had a lot of control even over the local people and whatnot, and they could literally do what they wanted to do, like, and you couldn't stop them. Whereas if an individual come along to do the same thing, he got an awful lot of obstacles put in his way. Yeah. In 1956 it was, there was a big ad in some commercial papers in England. The RAF were selling about 40 aircraft, and I got a whisper from somebody to put a bid in for them. So I put a bid in for each of them at 200 quid a piece. And a couple of months went by, and one of these letters came with HMS on the top. I said, that looks important. I had a look inside, and it was just a question, how many do you want? So I hadn't 2 shillings to rub together, and I went across along to the old man, and I said, how about a few bob? And he warned me about the flying and warned me, but in any case, he came up with a few bob. I purchased them. I think I bought 4 of them at that time. I didn't do. I think he agreed with me when I sold them again after getting them for 2,000 quid a piece, like, you know. He said that wasn't too bad, keep on. So that was my entry into the aeroplane business. Now the next thing, at that time, facilities here in this country weren't what you'd call encouraging for general aviation and light aviation. So I went along to the Department of Industry and Commerce, and through Aer Lingus it was, and wants to know could I operate from Dublin Airport, and after a lot of carry on, they gave me a piece of ground there. But like everything else, anybody that's doing any business with government things, read the small print very closely. It was only a 10-year lease. And the lease was very good, but when it came to renew it, the second time, you want to see the jump. They're talking about jumps of 5 and 10%. It was 10,000% jump in the price. But I operated very successfully at Dublin Airport, but Dublin Airport became a place where private airplanes are no longer. It's verboten for them to go in there at all, actually. They're not wanted in the place. In fact, it's not a place for them in any case with all the heavy traffic. But I had a very successful time there. And during my time at Dublin Airport, I think, I'd hate to count the number of pilots, but there's a big number of them flying for Ryanair, flying for Aer Lingus, flying all over the world there. And on the mechanical end, I always agreed with training my own engineers, and as a result of that, I think we have the chief engineer of City West or whoever it is, and Desi O'Brien here and a few others. And they all started, Desi and them started as an apprentice at 15 years of age with me. And I think it was from him I learned all the colourful language too. Even the department helped me along those lines when they gave me a registration called BUM. I won't tell you what I told them to send out to look and inspect it. But in the aircraft business and in the motor business, I've made some tremendous friends. In fact, lifelong friends. And they all keep in touch with me. And that is one thing that is, at my age, well, I like it. There's no doubt about it. So, thank you again all for coming.